to the Atlanta Startup Podcast. Today I'm joined by Courtney Schickel, who is one of the premier minds when it comes to building out early stage sales and revenue ops functions. Courtney, welcome to the podcast.
Good morning.
Awesome. I'm excited for you to share your brilliance today as a former CRO of multiple acquired or exited startups. But I think level setting and giving our audience the Courtney story and your background and journey of navigating multiple VP of sales and CRO roles would be the ideal place for us to start. So I'll turn it over to you to share more about your background.
Well, thank you for the lovely introduction. Hopefully my interview supports that praise there. So my background is interesting. It kind of started, wasn't where I thought I would go or what I would do, but I was originally an art major, and then ended up graduating with a marketing background. First couple of years out of school, a few jobs here and there, and didn't really know, what made the most sense. But I landed in a startup company out of a physician's kitchen with 4 other people, which was a little scary at the time. But I think the biggest thing for me is I just never really understood what I didn't know. So I think that was a huge benefit when you had a group of 4 or 5 rookies at the first startup. Like, we didn't know any better. So there weren't a lot of preconceived or, what works, what doesn't work, how are you supposed to do things. It was just kind of an open opportunity and figured it out. And it worked out really well. Great story with the first company I was with, which was IngeniousMed, and that grew significantly over the years. And I don't know that I actually didn't start with the intentions of being in sales. It just happened. It was one of those things to where you start with a limited number of people and resources, and people just start doing things and learning things. And then you figure out, how can you build upon that? Moving forward from there, that was a long journey, and it was all in healthcare. So the next opportunity that I went to, slightly bigger, starting with 5. And I think when we exited, there was maybe 200 plus employees. I did miss a little bit of that early stage size. But the good thing is I found another company where it was revenue wise more established, but the size of the company was a little bit smaller. So it's still that fun, fast moving, able to get things done quickly. And that was really where I enjoyed staying for a while. And then my last venture, I left healthcare, which I think a lot of people, should I, shouldn't I had such a history and knowing the landscape, but made the jump and couldn't be happier. It was a nice, refreshing change, and it was a little bit faster pace. It was a little bit of a challenge for me too. I like the fact that it was something different. I wasn't kind of doing the lather, rinse, repeat of working with the same type of clients and going back after 15 years of being in the same industry. It was good to have a change. So I think sometimes challenging yourself by mixing it up is a great way to keep your own energy up and take on a new challenge. So that was a fun one, and that was significantly smaller than where I was. I did jump back to like a really early stage, and it was fun just to go through the different phases. I think for me, when you grow from 5 to 200, you kind of figure out which parts did you like the most, and then you try to recreate that. But then obviously, if you're doing your job well, you're going to leave those stages, which is very rewarding, but at the same time, it's not going to stay that way. So then you can kind of find your next venture and figure out, okay, did I miss really having my hands in the mix and having things in such an early raw scenario, or did I like it when I had a lot more resources? And you can kind of jump around and figure out where you're happiest and where you really can make your mark.
Yeah, that's such a fascinating start, right? You began in college as an art major and graduated, and then obviously started in sales with a healthcare focus. And I would love for you to sort of walk us through and talk to us about finding your feet in the sales function at a startup so early on in your career, when you admitted you were a bit just naive and didn't know what you didn't know, right?
And I think a lot of it was just, we had one salesperson. I was actually coming into to help with marketing, just watching and learning. So they would have presentations, and a lot of it was the founder, in the early days doing the majority of the sales pitches. But he was a physician, and we had a very green salesperson as well. And just watching people's reactions, what's working, but more importantly, what's not working. In the end, like, and we'll talk about it a little bit too, like sales is how sales as a whole has changed and developed over time. But in the end, it's a person making a decision. And you got to learn how to read the room, and you can have the greatest product out there, but if you're not understanding what their need is. And so a lot of it was just watching the interactions. And to me, that just not knowing any better, like sales, in my mind, I was like, sales training, sales, whatever, like, if you can listen to people, you can figure this out and get pretty far.
Right.
So I think that was my biggest thing, was just not knowing, and not caring that, what was the sales process, or what were the different ways. I knew as we started to grow and develop, salespeople would come in and looking at different sales methodologies, but at the same time, like, it's people, it's interactions. It's going to be different every time. You just got to figure out what works and how can you connect with them.
Right. And so as your perspective matured from just one, doing the job, and two, observing senior leaders on the job, talk to us more about some of the lessons and learnings of like being a part of an organization that grew from 5 to ultimately 200 people and beyond that. And some of the takeaways as an early sales leader that maybe some of our listeners today can extract from your point of view.
I think there's a couple things. You do learn, there's only so much I can do. So you got to figure out how to build a team. And even if you're the most effective person, like at some point, like whether it's your territory or number of people that you can talk to in a day, right? There's only so much that you can do. So you've got to figure out how to build a team. Which parts and pieces can you hand off? How can you guys work together, make people more efficient, more effective? It's going to depend on just what you're selling and who you're selling to, right? There's going to be different ways that you can do it. So I think the other big learning was what works amazing for me might not work for other salespeople. So being open to, people figuring out different ways to do things. And then as you grow, there are things in early stage companies that I know don't make sense once you have a sales team of 20. You would never do it that way. But at the time, there's a lot of really short-term creative things you can do that if you're going to be in kind of this early stage, fast growth world, what I would do for a company if we have a team of 25 or we're in a certain scenario, like I get it. It seems odd. It's a strange commission plan or whatever it is, and it's incentive, but it's just designed to jumpstart things. It's not going to be long-term, and it won't work once you get to a certain stage. But there are things that you can do to be creative, and you've got the liberty to do that. When you're small, you can make fast changes. You can do things different, and you've got the ability to try things. So I think be creative. The other thing that I did learn is we did have a couple different sales leaders before I eventually moved up. And one of my biggest pet peeves is we had someone that came from a competitor. And I think that was like the drawing factor initially, but every answer, everything that he wanted to do was because that's how our competitor did it. And that made no sense to me, because why would we do it the same? Like you're trying to beat them, right? You have to find your differentiator. And I was like, even if it was just their proposal or their pricing or whatever it was, like be different. Particularly in the early stages, there's always going to be your competition or something similar in the market. Figure out a way to find one or two things that you can just do differently and run with it. I think a lot of times people are afraid to do stuff that changes or mixes it up, and it won't always work. Some people may want it to look, vanilla and what they're used to. And some people may really bite on an alternative. So I think I learned that as you start to build teams, trust your team, like let them, they're the ones that if they're talking to the potential prospects on the phone or the customers daily, like give them some opportunities to try different things. You never know what's going to stick or what'll work.
It's true. And that's interesting insight there, Courtney. And I'll ask you to answer this next question from the perspective of your time with IngeniousMed
Mhm.
and then secondarily your time with AssureSign as
Yeah.
well. When you first started at IngeniousMed in 2004, what did you believe to be true of building out a revenue or sales organization that you sort of had as a preconceived notion, but now you look retrospectively and you're like, that's not true. Like, I wish I would have thought about this differently.
Differently. I would say in 2004, I don't know that I had much preconceived. I mean, I was fairly new, just a few years out of school. Um, I can say though, like the importance of getting your leadership team all on the same page. So particularly in Genius Med, and especially in the later years, like it's very common to have kind of finance versus sales. If they're not on the same page, it's going to be a struggle, right? Like you want your incentive plans, you want everything to be very sales friendly, very positive. And I think that's something that you can't build a sales organization within the sales team. Like it has to be your whole leadership team on board. And it's got to be from the start. Like you've got to do it together as a team. It can't be something where you come up with like, here's how I want my plans to be, or here's how I think this is going to go. So that would be one thing.
Process, I would ask, what processes or internal guidelines you should set for making sure alignment is always, in conjunction with these executive teams, because oftentimes, you work in silos a lot of times, but
Yeah,
are
it's not
cross-functional.
good.
Yeah. I would ask you, like, what are some of the best practices that you saw and maybe didn't see for making sure there was a consistent and constant alignment of vision?
I think, it can be as simple as a weekly standing Monday meeting. And it's just something that the team, sometimes the meetings can be short and everyone's, gets busy. And if there's not a lot to go over, or if you have other meetings, but make it a priority, make sure that it happens. Sometimes they might be fast and easy. Sometimes they might go on much longer, but make it happen. And then come up with some type of, process to it. Keep a rhythm or a flow of the meeting that you repeat every time. And sometimes it can be like, no updates here, no updates there, but keep it standardized so that you don't forget or miss anything. And there's not a surprise, or there isn't something that we forgot to cover, we thought somebody was in the loop on. Just keep it standardized and stick to it.
Right. I love that. And so now I'll fast forward a bit to your time with Assure,
AssurSign.
and I'll ask you, what's one thing that as a CRO is easier now than it was, let's say 5-10 years ago when you were operating? Obviously, technology has significantly advanced.
Yes.
But like from a 50,000 foot view, what has become more simplified and even more complicated on the other side of the coin?
I think so much automation has happened, right? And there's more analytics, there's more automation, there's all these things, but it does also create noise in some ways. Easier in ways because you have a lot more information. Easier in ways because I do think this concept of early stage companies, and it's a lot more common now, and the world of software sales has really blown up, and that's the standard. That's what everyone's doing on a daily basis now. So I think there's a lot more understanding and acceptance of the ups and downs, the growth and the stages. Like I think 15 years ago, and maybe it's just because I was new to it, but I feel like now there's just a better understanding of startup companies and what it takes and the different stages and how you can move through it. I just think it's a lot more open and accepted. And I think the peaks and the valleys are a lot more open and accepted. If you've got to allow some people a little bit of longevity, not to the point to where it sinks, but some flexibility to try things and do things differently. I don't think 10 years ago, we were as creative and open as many companies are today.
Mhm. Yeah.
What was the second part of that? What's the harder part though, is I think there's just so much more noise.
How can one block out that noise? Difficult, right? You think about all of the different platforms and softwares that are being thrown at you and pitched in your inbox as a CRO, a sales
A
leader,
lot.
right? And I think you mentioned just blocking out the noise because the customer journey is ever evolving. And I think that's what you really have to focus on. And how can technology sort of intertwine and
With
align
that.
with your goals of driving revenue as an organization? So, I mean, it's probably almost impossible to block out the noise, but there are some things that you can do and put your blinders on.
I think you can just do your best to simplify it. I mean, that's my number one thing with sales as a whole, right? Do not overcomplicate it. Do not try to over process it, keep it simple, particularly for people on the other side too, right? Like you want it just to be easy, fast. Like if I am interested, how do I get from point A to it's up and running, and just make it as easy as you possibly can. Don't complicate it. Don't add to it. So I think for me, I created my own dashboard.
Mhm.
And yes, there's probably a lot more information and other parts and pieces. And I would have people give me reports or updates. I didn't use all of it. There were, pick your 2 or 3 key metrics that you really own and understand. And, that's kind of if something starts to go awry, then you can go dig into the rest. But I think don't overdo it. Like have it all funnel into something and then just pick your simplified dashboard to where you can keep a quick temperature check and catch anything. But over analyzing, I think it's a problem that you can have today. And again, it still goes back to people, right? There's data and there's tons of data and it can tell you trends. But in the end, it is usually a live person making a decision. And they may just go with the other person one day because they liked their hair better. There are elements of that it's still people. And I think just not getting lost with how it's all managed in the different processes. There was a company, I don't want to say the name because I don't know how it turned out, but initial results were good, but they actually shifted. I, as a salesperson, would have hated it. I don't know that I could do it, but they changed from like a traditional commission model to where they were just bonusing people based on productivity. Because the belief was, when you look at your pipelines and you're trying to build out a sales team or your quotas and all the stuff, like most salespeople look at it to where it's like, okay, if I need to close 100,000 a month to be on track, I probably need 2.5 to 3.5. In my later stages, you work backwards, right? Which means that you probably needed 5 meetings or 5 in this stage, and like you go backwards through it. And so I think the model was, we believe that the product is good and it'll sell itself and the company is there. So if we just incentivize people on the activity, the results will happen. The results initially, according to the person that I was talking to, were good. I don't know long-term, like how that panned out. I, as a old school salesperson, would have hated that model though, because I was also super competitive and you want the wins. Like you want the incentives on the wins. But if you think about it, that is a little bit of taking a step back and just trying to simplify it. So I think there are things you can do to where, is that too much data? Is it relying on data enough? It's hard to say what the answer is, but I think every organization will be different. I think, a quick sales process versus the long, complex one. What works in one versus the other are going to be very different. So I think I had the luxury of dealing with both. With Assursign, like that was kind of the first time that I moved into a much faster sales process, which I enjoyed. After spending healthcare, they'll tell you a year-long sales process, but it can be 2, if not 3, and I think in one case 5 are still counting. So a little bit of fun where you can do different things depending on the the environment that you're in. But
Right. And how does the rev ops function have to differ or be adjusted when it comes to the overall sales cycle, right? You mentioned with IngeniousMed, little bit longer. It's associated
longer.
with healthcare, but AssureSign, it was shorter, faster, more robust. How does the rev ops function have to align with both sides of the coin there?
It's tricky. I mean, you've got to find a balance. And I think we were able to kind of separate. So for AssureSign, the majority of it was more fast, like call it 30 to 60 day sales process, which is a lot faster and easier. So that is where something does start to look more at activity. And that is a scenario to where that can really help you encourage. So when we talked about the metrics and the different things, like make sure you're rewarding in the right areas, right? It could be something to where not a traditional just commission for the close, but some type of activity things would keep those funnels going and do it differently. In a longer sales process, that's more difficult, right? Because if you're working on something for a year, I mean, you might have activity for 12 months with nothing to show for it. So I think making sure too, when you're looking at your plans, like I kind of separated deals over a certain size amount. I put them in kind of a different bucket for AssureSign because they did become longer processes. It was a different sales team than the people that are doing the quick turn. So we kind of had one person that handled more of like a partnership type large deal. I separated the two because I did need them to be tracked differently, compensated differently. Like it's just different.
Interesting. And
I divided it, but also AssureSign was a lot smaller,
right.
so I could do it. I mean,
Yeah.
I had a team of 6 to where I can manage it that way.
Yeah.
If I had 30 people, like if we had gone to a certain place, that probably would be a mess.
I can only imagine, but no, that's fascinating insight because you're right. There are so many factors that are going to go into it: company size, contract size, those types of things, ACVs. So as we sort of move forward past AssureSign now, you've been doing this for over 20 years successfully. And as you sort of think about modern day company building, what is your advice and best practice for a CEO building out a revenue ops function or sales function today at the early stage?
I think, make sure go back to that leadership team and that everyone on the same page, make sure it's a good fit. You might have multiple candidates with proven track records, but figure out who's going to mesh with the company best, obviously. And then when you bring someone in early stages, you often have a founder that's still very involved, or certain people that have had their hands in different departments because simply the size and lack of expansion yet. Like once you start to build out these teams and bring people on board, like let them run with it. Give them some leeway. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. I think, doing things different and being creative and figuring out fail a few times, right?
Mm-hmm.
And see what you learn from it. I think that is the biggest thing, is like my advice would be, even anyone that has a process, like I can tell you things that I would do or things that I've repeated, but I don't know that would work in the next one.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like you've got to be open to understanding and constantly shifting and changing. I mean, look at how much the sales process has changed just with automation. And then we're all on Zoom for all of COVID and stuff, right? Like if you used to have a model to where you were an in-person salesperson, or that face-to-face was really the model, like you've got to shift and change, and you've got to figure out different things. So I think be creative and be willing to make mistakes along the way.
I love that. I mean, I think that's applicable advice to almost everything in life is get creative as you can. Don't be afraid to fail, embrace change. So those are great insights, Courtney. And, as we wrap up the conversation here, we talked a lot about the evolution of sales and rev ops functions from 2004 when you started, and when you worked with IngeniousMed,
Yeah.
helped them successfully grow, helped AssurSign successfully exit as well. I'm sure at that point you worked and led a lot of teams and dealt with a lot of younger, newer, fresher talent that came into the industry. So what were some of the common misconceptions that they had while you were leading them, or preconceived notions that just simply weren't true and you tried to dispel those notions for them?
I think with a lot of the greener salespeople that came in, and in both cases, I mean, we were, their resume basically had their GPAs on it, and maybe an intern. Like, I do think the younger salespeople, or greener, I should say, not younger, but and this last wave, the AssurSign, I do think there was a concept of like, well, I've taken these sales classes or I've read these things, and I think there's just a huge difference in training and then actually getting your feet wet and doing the job. I think that there's always a learning curve with that. So helping earlier stage salespeople to figure that out, and what you've read in a sales book here, sales book there, like they're guides, and there's a lot of great ones out there, and there's some that I think are terrible. Like, figure it out, right? Use it all as a way to create your own version or your own menu of what works for you. I think the other thing that was interesting for me, more so at IngeniousMed when we grew significantly bigger, my concern or preconceived notion is I thought some experienced salespeople or people that had 10, 15 years on me would not respond well to me as their leader. But when you get the right salespeople, and a true salesperson really is just there because they want to make money. Like they want to go and sell. And if I can help them do that, there wasn't really an issue with being younger or having less experience from a longevity standpoint on my resume overall. And what I was doing was different at that point, right? Like, if it was salesperson to salesperson, like, yes, they had 15 years on me in healthcare, and I was 5 years in and moving into a leadership position. But I do think, part of that's with the interview process and everything, getting a team that just really works well together. And I know maybe one or two salespeople along the way, but for the most part, I would say I did a really good job on getting some fun teams together, and they enjoyed it. And many of them are in leadership roles now, to where they're not just a salesperson anymore, but they have graduated and moved up. And one or two of them have gone back to sales, which it happens, right? Like, it's,
Did you
leadership.
deal with imposter syndrome at that point of your career when you were having to lead people who had 10, 15 years of sales experience on you?
No, because they came from established companies, and I knew in the case of IngeniousMed, I mean, the first year there were 5 of us, right? I knew how to log into the back of the system and add users and tweak and change things. I knew that company inside and out. I knew the program inside and out in a way that nobody could ever catch up to me. So I understood our organization. I understood our early customers, because when you were a salesperson in the early days, you also answered the phone and took tech support calls and did trainings. So there was an element of understanding our company that someone with 40 years of sales experience couldn't catch me on how to navigate and how to do certain things. So there was a huge advantage on that.
Yeah.
And I think too, like I had a great track record. I think, if you talk to any of the clients, or when they were starting to build out and work with existing customers, at one point, I think 75% of them were sold by me. So there was some clout with that helped, but just having an understanding of the inner workings of the company from the start.
Yeah. Nobody
was
could
a
tell.
huge advantage.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. And you touch on how some of the greener, newer sales individuals, account executives, whatever their position may be, has some preconceived notions from classes that they may have taken in undergrad, things like that.
Yep.
Maybe they heard from elders in the pipeline, whatever it may have been. But are there any resources for founders, AEs, VP of sales, anybody in these rev op functions that you've successfully leveraged over the years of your career that have turbocharged you or augmented your learning?
I had a mentor that I worked with for a while, but she was actually more from a marketing perspective. And that was something that I think when all the automation and all these different parts and pieces change, and then, I did take on a lot of the rebranding with IngeniousMed when we were going to market and looking to have our first exit. That I worked with that. I would say there's a lot more of that available today. I think you can use your resources in your network. I know who mine are personally. Like, I mean, I can tell you Gary would be somebody that I would leverage and find out who he works with or other people that he has. I think a lot of these places around Atlanta, you've got Atlanta Tech Village, you've got these little incubators and places where they're, collecting all the early startup and like minds and the entrepreneur programs there. Utilize them. There's some great resources within that, and they're very easy to find. And I think we tried to do, I know our building used to have like a Friday lunch thing and they had pitch practice, right? Like your salespeople could pitch to other people in the building because they were also trying to get practice as well. So we were at the ATV, which does a really good job of providing some opportunities like that. And I think there's multiple scenarios in Atlanta, and I think everyone kind of has some access to that, but use your network.
Yeah, it sounds like you found maybe a gold mine in leveraging cross-functional relationships within an organization and external to the organization to augment your ability as a sales leader. So that's
absolutely, other people's experience and expertise. Like, I know what I've been exposed to, but when you're going to something else, like, absolutely, like, reach out to the people that you respect or enjoy, or that they're in a company that's doing well, or you think that their job sounds interesting, or that they're trying new things. Like, use that. And then I think a lot of early stage companies, like, you're gonna have your portfolio teams and the other companies that are in and around you, like, work with each other. We used to do that. We had like a kind of like a sister company when we were at IngeniousMed, and if they got a hold of some new marketing software that was helping them get leads, like, we hopped right on over, looked at it, understood it, like, will it work for us? What can we do there? But you should easily be able to just quick phone call, email, reach out and find people that you can leverage. And it's a big plus, because I think we all have our own way of looking at things, and you can get really stuck in your own status quo. So branch out, look at something differently, figure out how other people are doing it. Kind of like I said, it sounded horrible to me, but the sales commission plan where it changed to just the productivity, like, I, as a salesperson, would have been livid and started looking to leave because that wouldn't make sense to me. And that just was a new model. But I was intrigued by it. And I am talking about it a couple of years later, because it's completely in left field or out of the box of anything that I would have thought of to do. But there's huge opportunity to learn from it.